Good evening. My name is Richard Drake, and I teach history at the university. I apologize for this basso profondo tonight. I lost my voice late last night, but I'm slowly regaining it, and I think I can rasp out this introduction from my good friend David Emmons. I have known David Emmons for more than 27 years. I met him in February of 1982 when I visited the university for a job interview. David was my first chairman in the history department, and we were colleagues there for more than 20 years. David's accomplishments do not lend themselves to a quick summary. But my superiors in the community lecture series have urged me to be brief above all. So I will do my best to give you an overview of the gaudy highlights of this quite extraordinary career. David arrived in Montana in 1967. And he began his storied career as a teacher in our department, offering a series of courses on 19th and 20th century U.S. history. Many of these courses were pioneering offerings in the then fledgling field of social history. One of his courses in particular became a folk legend on our campus. And this was, let me get the exact title right here, his Ireland and Irish American course. The other day, I read the article in the Missoulian about our Irish Studies course at the University of Montana. And I didn't find David Emmons' name there. And it occurred to me that not finding David Emmons' name in that article was a little bit like reading a piece about the founding of the United States and not finding George Washington's name in the account. David is the real pater patriae of our Irish Studies program, which has now, I think, gained recognition as one of the most innovative of its kind in the country. In recognition of his outstanding record as a teacher, David received the Distinguished Teacher Award in 1994. In further recognition of his stellar career in the classroom and with our students, he received the university's Outstanding Advisor Award. This was in 1998. Now, in addition to his manifold accomplishments as a classroom instructor and as a mentor to generations of students, David has been an extraordinarily prolific publisher of original scholarship. I want to focus just on two of his many publications. The first of them is the Butte Irish, Class and Ethnicity in an American Mining Town, 1875 to 1925. This book appeared in 1989 under the imprimatur of the University of Illinois Press. It is now in its 6th printing. And the year that the book appeared, David won, or the book won, the Ellis Island Statue of Liberty Centennial Prize. That same year, the University of Montana recognized David, recognized his achievements with the Bute Irish by naming him the Burlington Northern Distinguished Achievement for Scholarship winner that year. The next year, 1990, the book won the Robert G. Athern Prize for the best book written on the 20th century West in the previous 2 years. Also, in 1990, the book received honorable mention for the James B. Donnelly Prize for the best book on Irish or Irish American history. Now, ladies and gentlemen, 2 national prizes, an honorable mention for a 3rd national prize, a campus research award, mean that you've written a pretty darn good book. This is how the academic army puts bars on your shoulders. And reports to the contrary notwithstanding, this is the only way those bars get there, by writing original scholarship and gaining the recognition of one's peers. Now, there's much more that I would like to say about David's research record, but I'm going to confine myself just to one other title. David supposedly retired in 2001, but you'd never really know this from looking at his phenomenal publication record. He recently completed another major work of scholarship with the title of Beyond the American Pale, The Catholic Irish and America's Mythic Frontier, 1845 to 1905. This book has been accepted for publication by the University of Oklahoma Press and will appear early in 2010. I want to beg your indulgence and read just a very small excerpt from a reader's report that this book received. It's a report written by Richard White, a very distinguished scholar, historian at Stanford University. And I think this short paragraph will give you an inkling of David's august standing in the world of scholarship. And I quote from Richard White: "The book's announced purpose is to write a history of the Irish and Irish Americans in the American West. But to say that this is what the book is about would be like saying Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance is a repair manual. Beyond the American Pale uses the Irish and the West as a platform for far-reaching ruminations about the nature of 19th century American history, the power of mythic formulations, the nature of Irish identity and Irish American society, the respective power of anti-Catholicism and racism, the analogs between anti-slavery and anti-Catholicism, and more." I think on the strength of Richard White's praise that we can confidently anticipate another raft of prizes for David as this book appears. I'd like to make just a couple of more general points about my friend David. In his books and vast outpouring of articles on social history, David has been in the forefront of those historians who sought to provide an answer to a question raised in 1846 by Karl Marx in the German Ideology. The then young Karl Marx asked, "Where in the history books are the workers?" He went on to say, when I open those books, I find pages that are filled with the deeds of kings and popes and generals, but the people have gone missing. In 1963, E.P. Thompson, a Marxist social historian, famously wrote in The Making of the English Working Class that he hoped to liberate working class people from what he called the enormous condescension of posterity. Now, with these references to Marx and to Thompson, I do not intend to affix a hammer and sickle image to David's scholarship. I think that I know my friend's politics well enough to be able to say with complete assurance that for all these years in Missoula, he has not been operating a communist cell. Marx's political influence cannot be counted as one of the blessings bestowed upon mankind in the 20th century. But his intellectual influence is a much more discussable matter. In asking the historians to open the doors and windows of their establishment, to let the people in, it was a necessary request, it seems to me. And with his vital research work and teaching, David has been part of this most welcome expansion of history's subject matter. In closing, I'd like to say that before becoming chairman of the history department 2 years ago, I served for 11 years as the faculty evaluation committee chair. In that capacity, I had the opportunity to examine the teaching records of all of my colleagues every year. That was a job that fell to me. And in one teaching evaluation that David received, I have a very distinct recollection of what one of his admiring students said. She said that she thanked him for bringing into the classroom the world of workers, of immigrants, of the Irish, all those people ever and always enormously condescended to by posterity. I think that we need to thank David as well for a teaching and writing career nobly spent. Tonight, he will speak to us about a case of mistaken identity, myth and reality in Montana and Western history. Please join me in welcoming him to this lectern.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those very generous remarks. I'm tempted to apply and come back since he's the chair. There's one thing he didn't point out that I'd like to add to the record. In 1967, when I got here, I was only 9 years old. So it's been a long career, but I can say I've enjoyed almost all of it. I wish you all a very, very good evening. And also, if you'll indulge me, Agnos Bonachti na Phaila Para. That is my feeble Irish language skills, an effort to say, and a happy St. Patrick's Day as well. I know that all of you are giving up what are more traditional ways of misbehaving to be here tonight. And I'm sorry to tell you that my topic is more melancholic than joyful or celebratory. But then the same can be said of the sainted Patrick, so perhaps it's a more appropriate topic than I knew. The general theme for this year's community lecture series, as you know, includes an interesting subtitle, Dispelling Myths. I think the full title is Hidden Montana, What We Don't Know About This Place Where We Live, and dispelling the myths that encrust it. In the spirit of fair dealing, however, I'd like to begin by dispelling what might be a few myths about myth. If nothing else, and there is a good deal else, they are inescapable. All societies have them. Myths of origin, myths of development, eschatological myths, in other words, myths of the end times. These are stories fashioned by a wide variety of people, the society's elders, both secular and spiritual, its storytellers, Shanachies and the Irish, its chieftains and poets and music men, all of the keepers of the bundles, all of the guardians of the collective memory. Now, it is also, and unfortunately, I think, true that sooner or later these myths will fall into the hands of the purveyors of popular culture, who will rather quickly corrupt them. But in the process, at the same time, in fact, that they corrupt them, they strengthen the myth's hold on the public consciousness, or perhaps, and more accurately, the public subconsciousness. Now, the most important of these myths, of the shared legends of a people, are the so-called myths of concern, the stories that reflect a society's core reality. And this is a very, very simple point. Hunter society mythology centers around predator and prey. Agricultural societies have a different mythology, gods of sun and rain, of festive and seasonal celebrations and supplications to both. Irish society, and I keep coming back to the sainted Partig, Irish society was centered around devotional Catholicism and the theme of exile, and so then were most of its myths of concern. But we're here to talk about the American myth of the West, and so I add the obvious. A modern, industrial, and imperial society like America had as its basic concern or issue the struggle for class and or racial hegemony, of mastery of those two very troublesome aspects of 19th century industrialization. Class was an issue because industrial capitalism created class tensions, and the myth of concern was bound then to be involved in that issue. Racial issues arose because expansionist societies encountered a great variety of racial and ethnic others. Now, the heroes of these myths of concern, and all mythical worlds have their heroes, were those who were best at doing what the society in question most needed doing. More complex societies necessarily asked more of their mythical heroes. So did nervous societies, and we were a bit of each. But regardless of the nature and or anxiety level of the society in question, it was only a short step from hero to demigod. And certainly in the American myth world, many of our heroes were elevated to that status. Now, this creates certain problems for historians. They are always questing for some semblance of truth. The problem is what to do with these myths, who are demonstrably not true. The myths either describe something that did not happen, exaggerate and distort what in fact did happen, or ripped what happened out of historical context. Myths then make for excellent moralizing because they are thought to be applicable to all times and all places, but they make for a very disordered understanding of the past. They also make, and I'll get to this, for some very disastrous policy. These myths say then much more about those who called on them for moral guidance or class and racial mastery than they do about the events and people they purport to describe. The question of the relationship of myths to history, then, is a tangled one. In fact, I would argue that merely asking the question, what is the relationship between myth and historical reality, is misleading. It suggests, does that question, that the two can somehow be easily separated. It implies that myth is on one side of the cultural spreadsheet, history is truth, and resides on the other. This dichotomous labeling, however, leads to a bloodless and incomplete understanding of the past, and it leaves out a lot of people. Myth is not historical reality's opposite. It is not even historical reality's ugly stepsister. Myth is a large part of the historical reality. Myths are historical facts. Now, often, in fact, the fact of the myth is more historically important than the real fact. And if you can follow that, you'll be able to follow everything that comes after it. Myths can be lamented then. We can mourn them. We can even dispel them. But we cannot ignore them. Now let me give an example, a case in point which has absolutely nothing to do with my topic, everything to do with St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick, as we all know, or at least it has been said of him, drove the snakes out of Ireland. That's a myth. There were no snakes in Ireland. That truth, however, is of no historical significance except perhaps to the ophidiophobic. I looked that up. It's those who are fearful of snakes. But what of the myth? The sainted Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland. Now, it's true that the Irish added some interesting Druidic features of their own devising, but they centered these features, these Irish features, uniquely Irish features, on their particular piety and their stout ability to resist temptation. But I ask, what occasioned the first and original sin? Well, the serpent, of course, the snake who persuaded Eve that eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge was a very good thing indeed. But the Irish, says this myth, have no snakes. St. Patrick drove them out. They are then, if not entirely sinless, at least untempted. Now, cynics may argue that they are also quite clueless. It was, after all, the tree of knowledge from which Eve ate. But whatever side of the dispute you take, the myth, not the reality, is the important fact of Irish history. Consider, too, to bring the story a bit closer to home, the wonderful and often misquoted line from Montanan Dorothy Johnson's short story, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. This is the West, a newspaper man is told. The little town is Shinbone. We don't know where it is. Let's make it Montana. This is the West. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Now, for those of you who remember the movie, and I can't remember when it came out, you'll recall then that Jimmy Stewart didn't shoot Liberty Valance. Liberty was played by Lee Marvin. John Wayne, Donovan in the movie, shot Liberty Valance. But Stewart got the credit. That's the legend. And he also got the girl, which was important in those days. In fact, the girl was betrothed to Donovan, the character played by John Wayne, something that didn't happen that frequently in Western movies. But it was John Wayne who shot Liberty Valance. It was Jimmy Stewart who got credit for that, the man who shot him, and the credit brought him a wife and a seat in the United States Senate. But there's more to the myth, more of and to the myth than that. Stewart's character, you will also, I hope, recall, is by Western standards an anomaly. He is a thoughtful pacifist. He would not carry a gun. He seemed almost craven in his unwillingness to confront Liberty Valance. He believed that the law could bring order to the West. And in the mythical West, there was very little use for such as Stoddard, for such as Jimmy Stewart. Thus, what we have is a reputation for being a killer becoming the source of the good fortune of one who rejected killing. Legends within legends within legends becoming compound truths can make life difficult for historians. I also recall a painting. It was used as a poster for a conference on Western history. It was a painting of a painter. And the painter was in front of his easel and out in front of, and he was painting a Western scene. The landscape which was being depicted was, I wouldn't call it scabby, but neither would I call it exactly fruitful. It was a typical Western landscape. But the picture that was being painted, as we see the painting of the painter, was one of unbelievable fruitfulness. Now, there were enough similarities between the landscape and what was being painted. You knew he wasn't making it up. He couldn't have done this in the privacy of his studio. But he was going about putting the finishing touches on his picture so matter-of-factly that the impression was indelible. The West is defined by the myths that are told about it. If the legend becomes fact, print and paint the legend. Now, it is the historian's responsibility, and it's a heavy one actually, to print both the fact and the legend. We can't just leave St. Patrick driving snakes out of Ireland. The actual and the imagined each influence the other. The myths are false, but they are not falsehoods. Rather, they are explanations. Call them, and I like this phrase probably better than most, call them the lies that tell the truth. If asked then, what is the truth about the American West? The answer would have to include something like, it is the American region about which a great number of untruths have been told. As Richard White, whom you just heard from a moment ago, has written, the West is the most strongly imagined section of the United States. Now, the next question is how and why this happened. And this too, these issues are also a part of the historical calculus. Why the elaborate lies? Why do myths arise, particularly myths of concern that become as central to the functioning of this society as the American myth of the West has become? What have been some of the consequences of this mix of fact and fable? The Irish and snakes issue provides only a very partial answer, and that for Ireland. It provides no answer at all for the United States. An American, well, he's actually a professor of American studies at Wesleyan, Richard Slotkin, puts the matter this way. Myths are stories drawn from history that have acquired through usage over many generations a symbolizing function that is central to the cultural functioning of the society that produces them. Myths become part of the language as a deeply encoded set of metaphors that may contain all of the lessons we have learned from our history and all of the essential elements of our worldview, which is a rather elaborate way of saying that myths are a key component of a people's ideology. Myths don't argue that ideology, they exemplify it. They form the master narrative of a culture. They define us as a people. They allow us, they don't just teach us moral lessons, they teach us who we are, or who at least we think we are. All of a culture's ideology is contained then in myths, which means that they are inherently political. They're not just stories being told by shanachies and elders and other keepers of social bundles. They are political. They may not begin life as such, but over time they become a part of the political self-identification of a people. Americans don't just play cowboy. In their minds, they are cowboys. They live by some imagined code of the West. A man's got to do what a man's got to do. That is the lesson, the object lesson. Now, that is a uniquely political phenomenon, or at least it has had some uniquely political consequences. But these political myths also beg a question. Whose politics? And that, I think, is the rub. Theorists in cultural anthropology and historians, of course, distrust all theorists, particularly those of cultural anthropology, but they have argued, actually I trust this one, that in every structured society, and this is pretty loaded language that's coming your way, the ascendant class takes over the myths of concern and makes them a rationalization of its ascendancy. All right, what do we mean by that? Well, what is the ascendant society in America in, say, between 1850 and 1920, or 1850 and 2009, if you'd like? This oversimplifies it considerably, but certainly industrial capitalists would be among those, but I think they would have to be counted in the list. But so too, that's the class issue. Remember, Slotkin brought that up, the mastery, the hegemony of the ascendant class over the subordinate or working classes, the dominance of the users of labor over those who supplied that labor, usually for a wage, in the case of the South prior to 1865, as chattel slaves. So there's a class issue. But we are also an expansionist society in 19th century America. And there is then always that racial issue. We confronted, as we expanded, native peoples, men and women of color. We sought and had a certain mastery over them as well. Those were then the myths of concern, and the ascendant were the dominant class and I'll be misinterpreted here, but I'll try it anyway, the master race. 19th century America then belonged to white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant men. And the last part of that, I think I'll just leave for a different time and somebody else. But the first three parts of it are important. White, Anglo-Saxon, or Teutonic. And there was a great deal of discussion in the 19th century about an emerging American, and this word was used, an emerging American Volk. There was considerable emphasis on blood, and on good blood and bad blood, and what the differences were between the two, other than the goodness of the one and the evil of the other. We are back, in other words, to Slotkin's myths of concern of a modern industrial and imperial society. Now, to be white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant was to be an old line American, members of the founding race. And this is at a time when race was used very differently from the way it's used now. The Irish were a separate race. Germans were a separate race. Americans were a mixed people, but they were emerging as a separate race, and it was the mythical West where that full emergence was most manifest. These groups then, industrial capital and the founding race, would appropriate the Western myth, fine-tune it, and enlist it in the service of its interests. Now, I've said that myths are inherently political, but it is a historical rarity to see one as thoroughly politicized as this one became. And that is one of the more troubling aspects of America's Western myth, the fact that it did become so embedded in the ideology and so central in political discourse. But also troublesome, and I hope it's something that some of you have noted, is that the ascendant groups who incorporated the myth of the West and put it to work did not live in the West. All myths are inventions, lies that tell the truth. But usually, and ideally, a people are allowed the privilege of inventing their own. The Western myth, however, was the invention of people who did not live there, of Easterners who imposed it on an often uncomprehending West. It was not an indigenous creation. Now, some Westerners may have believed, even embraced the myth. I'll give you three Montana examples: Charlie Russell, Frank Bird Linderman, and Governor Brian Schweitzer. They have embraced the myth but they had nothing to do with its creation. By definition, then, the myth says more about the dreams and fears of the Easterners who constructed it than about the Westerners who lived in the Western reality. Let me quote Richard Slotkin again. For most Americans, and then notice this next line, to the perpetual dismay of Westerners. Now, Slotkin teaches in Wesleyan. I'm not sure, that's in Connecticut, I think. I'm not certain that he knows what causes us perpetual dismay. I'm not sure of whether we feel even transient dismay, but perpetual is heavy. For most Americans, to the perpetual dismay of Westerners, the West became a landscape known through and completely identified with the fictions created about it. And I would add, the fictions created outside it. The dime novels, the gazettes, the newspaper accounts, the political oratory, the travelers' reports, the artists' renditions, the novels, the Wild West shows, and they were extremely important, particularly those of Buffalo Bill. The movies, obviously, to jump about 80 years from Buffalo Bill to popular culture. Well, not 80 years, fewer than that. TV shows. As well, I would add, as the histories written by particularly Theodore Roosevelt, but to a lesser extent even Frederick Jackson Turner. This entire informal system by means of which the Western myth was crafted and distributed didn't have any Western participants. That's a kind of cultural imperialism in this, the idea that we cannot devise our own myths. Westerners did devise a few of their own, but they were always very local. There are enough myths in Butte to fill, small books, but they're all local. They apply to Butte. They are not part of a national myth culture. The Western myth, the big one that I'm here talking about, had no Western participants. And there is cultural imperialism in that. The South, we say, was reconstructed after the Civil War. I'm essentially arguing that the West was constructed after the Civil War, and for the same reasons, by the same contractors, using many of the same blueprints. All right, what did this Western myth look like? I think it's familiar enough to all of us. I don't have to spend a lot of time on it. And I don't know whether perpetual dismay accompanies any accounting of it. It depends a little bit, I guess, on what side of the painted painter's easel you're on. First of all, the West was not East. I think that is first and foremost. What is the West? Well, we're not certain, but it's not the East. That is, however, not particularly helpful. And so the list must be extended. The West was wild and violent. It was where civilization confronted savagery. It was a testing ground, a boot camp. I said there are a lot of encoded metaphors in this. Slotkin said it. But it was also second chance country, the guarantor of American democracy and our Republican institutions. It was a schoolhouse. It assimilated immigrants and defused the revolutionary instincts of this new industrial working class. It was a passageway to new markets and a commodities warehouse. It contained lands and minerals, wheat, corn, and cows. Mostly, however, it was where Americans were constantly being reborn. It was the playground of ruggedly individualistic and self-sufficient paladins. It was America's glory and America's future. And I'm compelled to add, or at least tempted to add, no place for old men. The West then was the underwriter of American exceptionalism. Now, a key player in all of this was Theodore Roosevelt. And I want to turn just briefly, and I'm going to skip over some of this, and find where I've got Theodore Roosevelt. Well, before I do that, let me tell just one story. I said I was going to tell some short stories. Let me tell this one, because I think it's an important example of what is happening in this Western myth. A lot of the stories about the West could be dismissed as self-congratulatory silliness. But we go back always to the political and ideological purposes which were subserved by it. And so here is my story. Listen to the following exchange. It's between Thomas O'Donnell, an unemployed Irish mule spinner from Fall River, Massachusetts, and a member of a congressional committee investigating the deteriorating relations between labor and management. The year was 1883, but it does not stretch historical credibility to imagine it occurring any time between 1865 or even 1845 and 1910. It was established that Thomas O'Donnell, when he was working, made about $150 a year, and that with that he had to support himself, his wife, and 5 children. O'Donnell told the congressman that he wasn't certain how he could meet his responsibilities, and one of them then offered him a lesson in the political economy of the free labor system and of the mythical West that was the prop of that system. Now, I think what follows sounds like a bad Abbott and Costello routine. So I'll read it as it was presented in the congressional record. "Why do you not go west on a farm?" the congressman asked the uncomprehending O'Donnell. "How could I go?" O'Donnell replied. "Walk it?" And this is the slapstick exchange that ensued. "Well, I want to know why you do not go out west. Take up a homestead and break it and work it up and then have it for yourself and family." "I can't see how I could get out west. I have nothing to go with." "It would not cost you over $1,500. I never see over a $20 bill, and that is when I have been getting a month's pay at once. If someone would give me $1,500, I will go." Now, O'Donnell was not threatening a rebellion of disgruntled workers. He was more weary than mutinous. But I have to believe that America's corporate heads, the ascendant class, were offering the same bromides that congressional commissioners were, and that they were quite aware of how they might be used to suppress labor's insurgent instincts. Now, we have, of course, a phrase for this, speaking of encoded metaphors. This is the West as safety valve. This is what preserved the industrial peace. American workers did not build barricades. That's what they did in France, a little of it in England. American workers went to Montana and filed on a homestead. America was not a society divided between haves and have-nots. It was a society united by the haves and the soon-to-have, the will-haves. This was myth, then, in the service of the privileged. But it could never have functioned effectively if presented as such. Now, Richard, I will hope, he can add to this after I'm finished if he wishes. But, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist theorist, had a word for this. This is hegemony. This is the way it works. The ascendant class controls not just the police force and the army. That's pretty heavy-handed, vulgar Marxism. Gramsci is suggesting that the ascendant class controls the ideas, in this instance, the myth worlds of the society of which they are ascendant. But they have to be subtle about it. They have to, whether they're conscious of this or not is actually unimportant. But they had to at least parade as didacts, as teachers, not as publicists, not as myth makers. Well, here's another small story, an example from 1898. I'm going to read to you from the billboard. It was a gigantic billboard advertising one of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. This is the language. "Look upon this picture." And there was a picture of Buffalo Bill and all of his friends and all of the American Indians who were riding around, and it was, a sales poster for the show. "Look upon this picture and behold the various epochs of American history, from the primitive days of savagery up to the memorable charge of San Juan Hill." We're back to Theodore Roosevelt. This wasn't just a show. It was, quote, "an object lesson, a living monument of historic and educational magnificence." Its distinctive feature lies in its sense of realism, and I'm quoting again, bold dash and reckless abandon, which only arises from brave and noble inspiration. It is a series of original, genuine, and instructive object lessons in which the participants repeat the heroic parts they have played in actual life upon the plains, in the wilderness, in the mountain fastnesses, and in the dread and dangerous scenes of savage and cruel warfare. It is the only amusement enterprise, and this is a revealing statement, of any kind recognized, endorsed, and contributed to by governments, armies, and nations. Now, there is no question that Eastern workers were expected to watch and to learn from these object lessons. If they didn't learn, if they did not pay attention to their lessons, they would be treated harshly. Here's a quote from a New York newspaper at the time of the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886. The paper, first of all, called for the exclusion of further immigration from Europe because, quote, such foreign savages with their dynamite bombs and anarchic purposes are as much apart from the rest of the people of this country, and note carefully the analog here, as much apart from the rest of the people of this country as the Apaches of the plains are. Which sort of misplaces the Apaches, but nonetheless. Frederick Remington, well known, I'm sure, to everyone here, and one of the more active of the myth makers, put it this way in one garbled and, I would argue, quasi-pathological statement. It revealed, did Remington's comment, quite a lot about himself, his class, and his friends, very little about the objects of his scorn. I quote him, Jews, Injuns, Chinamen, Dagos, Huns, the rubbish of the earth I hate. I've got some Winchesters, and when the massacring begins, I can get my share of them, and what's more, by God, I will. All right, consider too, and I think we must, the slightly menacing stories told by Theodore Roosevelt. Here's one, and for all I know, it happened. I mean, people have been trying to figure out Roosevelt historians for a long time. But he's writing here after his presidency, and he talks about a time when an old friend from, quote, the cow camps, a huge, powerful man, Jim by name, came to visit him in the White House. Jim had, quote, been a distinctly fighting character, and Roosevelt introduced him to the British ambassador at lunch. But he had to warn Jim that if he, quote, shot at the feet of the British ambassador to make him dance, it would be likely to cause international complications. Jim, model Westerner that he was, answered cowboy style, "Why, Colonel, I shouldn't think of it. I shouldn't think of it." Now, Roosevelt didn't say if Jim followed with a wink and a nudge. He did not need to. Everybody who read it, everyone who knew of that exchange, knew that it was in a code and that the code was known to all. It was the equivalent of handshakes and passwords and the ritualistic paraphernalia of secret brotherhoods. Now, the British ambassador, for his part, responded to this meeting with Jim, which would suggest at least that it might have occurred, by telling one of his friends in London that it was important to keep in mind, if good relations were to be maintained between Great Britain and the United States, that the president is, quote, only 6. Now, our 6-year-old president was a key player in all of this. We just got the records of the Boone and Crockett Club at the University of Montana, which was an unbelievable treasure to have. And Donna McCrae is to be thanked profusely for all that she did to get it. This is a collection that is going to be invaluable to any number of people. TR formed the Boone and Crockett Club in 1887, and it identifies itself now, and I think quite correctly, as a wildlife conservation organization. It didn't begin life, however, that way. when Roosevelt started it, he wanted to use it to establish the creation of hunting parks, small wilderness areas where his class of racial heroes could hone their skills and stay sharp. There was no place in these wilderness areas, in these hunting preserves, for white Indians, for labor militants, for Irish Catholics, whom Roosevelt once described as low, venal, corrupt, and unintelligent brutes. A slight improvement on Remington, but not much. All right, Roosevelt's then was the west of the Indian and the buffalo hunter. And I think here, too, there's something a little bit overwrought in his language. It is the west of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and the cowpuncher. It was a land of reckless riders who unmoved looked in the eyes of life or of death. In that land we led a free and hardy life with horse and with rifle. We knew toil and hardship and hunger and thirst, and we saw men die violent deaths. But we felt the beat of hardy life in our veins, and ours was the glory of work and the joy of living. They were living, as Roosevelt called it, the strenuous life. All right, those are some of the myths. What about, though, just a bit on the reality? Here again, I'll tell small stories that I think tell large truths. And in this first one, this is the sort of thing, when you're a historian and you're researching and something like this is literally dropped in your lap, you know that it's going to be a good day. And this particular story was perfect for my purposes in every regard. The year is 1886, and the writer of this story is Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter. She is accompanied by her friend and partner, I guess, I don't know that they call him that in the 19th century, but her unmarried friend, Dr. Edward Aveling. They were in America to raise money for socialist causes in Europe. They traveled from New York to Kansas City, giving lectures and attempting to make sense of the working class movement in America, as they titled the book that recounted their visit. They had a chance encounter in Cincinnati that advanced their education. Friends took them to a, quote, dime museum, where the featured attraction was a group of cowboys clad in their picturesque garb. A spruce gentleman in ordinary garments began to make stereotyped speeches about these cowboys. These were cowpokes on display, stage cowboys teaching object lessons. Americans were fascinated by them. Now, after a time, and mercifully, Eleanor Marx's word, the spruce gentleman, the little dandy, the foppish little fellow who's introducing these cowboys, stepped aside and gave the stage to, quote, a cowboy of singularly handsome face and figure with the frankest of blue eyes. His name was Mr. John Sullivan, alias Bronco John. And that, again, is quoted. And he would take up the parable, and the word is Eleanor Marx. Now, that she would refer to the cowboy tales as parables is of more than passing interest. That Bronco John was an Irishman, and of regal bearing no less, is of surpassing interest. But so is what he had to say. And it doesn't sound very much like Teddy Roosevelt. Sullivan clearly departed from the prepared text. He recited no parables, gave no stereotypical speeches. As Marx put it, to our, and I would guess everyone else's, great astonishment, Bronco John plunged at once into a denunciation of capitalists in general and the ranch owners in particular. Contrary to the stories in the Eastern press, the 8,000 to 10,000 cowboys in the West, remember again the year 86, were not the free-ranging heroes of myth, but a brutally exploited class of workers. As Marx and Aveling wrote, the cowboys themselves have made plain to us that they are distinctly members of the non-possessing yet producing and distributing class, that they are as much at the mercy of the capitalist as a new or old England cotton worker, which recalls Thomas O'Donnell, and that their supposed freedom is no more of a reality than his. Now, Bronco John and his pards, his word, did what exploited workers were doing everywhere. They tried, said Eleanor, to connect themselves with the laboring masses and with the general movement of that class. Likely, said Bronco John, through the Knights of Labor. Sullivan spoke for all of the herders. Quote, "No class," he said, "is harder worked, none so poorly paid." And the reason for this was simple. The cowboys had no union. And the ranch owners had one of the strongest and most systematic and despotic unions that was ever formed. Sullivan's reference was to the stock growers' associations that were inescapable parts of every western state where ranching was economically important, Montana included. The employers in the association paid the best of their riders $25 a month. They provided their boys with a horse, but nothing in the way of equipment. The work, said Bronco John, was dirty, exhausting, and dangerous, and included dealing with marauders and Indians. The cowboys, he said, have a serious struggle with actual want. They are told to fatten the cattle as they drive them, but we are not provided with enough food to keep ourselves adequately fed. The cattle arrived at the market town sleek and plump. The cowboys who brought them arrived exhausted and gaunt. And Sullivan concluded his remarks by telling his audience that the election of Blaine in the presidential contest of 1886, and you don't need to know anything about that election, would mean that all the thieving would go on. But then he added that the election of Henry George as mayor of New York, you might wonder what Bronco John is doing, how he even knew that Henry George was running as mayor of New York, but the election of George would make a change. What makes this doubly interesting is that one of George's opponents in the mayoral contest in New York in 1886 was Theodore Roosevelt. And something had to change. As matters stood, such is the system, said Bronco John. We dare not protest. Now, my second and final story involves a conversation I had with the late Tony Lucas. And I'll make it briefer than my notes would allow me. Lucas called me one day. He was writing a book that became Big Trouble. A murder in a small western town sets off a struggle for the soul of America. That's the full title, Big Trouble. But marked particularly his insistence that the soul of the nation was being contested. The soul of the nation is here being contested. Now, Lucas intended the book as the natural sequel to his Pulitzer Prize-winning and National Book Award-winning and brilliant book, Common Ground, a turbulent decade in the lives of three American families, which remains the best book on race relations in America I have ever read. Lucas wanted Big Trouble to do for the social class conflict what Common Ground had done for racial. And so he set about finding an event, an incident, a historical development that played out over time. Anything in the nation's past that could be used to reveal the depth and nature of social class tensions and conflict. Now, because Lucas was a journalist, he had resigned from the New York Times because they wouldn't let him use the word bullshit in an article that he had written. Because he was a journalist, the field was open to him. He could have taken his topic from anywhere and any time. That's a luxury historians don't have. He chose the 1907 trial of 3 officers of the Western Federation of Miners for the murder of ex-governor Frank Steunenberg of Idaho. One of the 3, William Haywood, was also a founder of the Industrial Workers of the World. Steunenberg was killed in his hometown of Caldwell, Idaho. The trial took place in Boise. The Western Federation of Miners had been founded 14 years earlier in Butte. Its offices had only recently been moved from Butte to Denver. The 3 defendants were kidnapped in Denver and brought to Boise for the trial. In other words, this battle for the soul of America had not just a Western location, it was at its core a Western story. Now, I had the rare occasion to ask Lucas how he came to find the trouble he was looking for in Boise. In the usual way of journalists, he answered. He began reading generally about the history of American workers. He then put together a list of a dozen possible topics and read carefully the secondary literature on each. He then pared his list to 6, read some more, then cut the list to 3, and finally to the 1. Now, Lucas was a New Yorker. He had seldom even traveled west, and he was utterly unprepared for where his search was taking him. Of the first 12 events, and to his astonishment, 10 took place west of the Mississippi River. Of the second 6, all were Western, as obviously was the final. Now, it's true. I mean, it's possible that he told me exactly what he knew I wanted to hear. I can't ask him now. He tragically committed suicide about 8 months after the book Big Trouble came out. He suffered horribly from depression, which I did not know the night of the dinner that we had. That's another story. But he did say that he was looking for a topic that had a plot line, characters that he could develop, that was a good story. Now, this one was certainly all of that. Steunenberg, ex-Governor Steunenberg, was literally blown to bits when he opened the gate of his home in Caldwell. This was on New Year's Eve, 1906. The defense of the 3 labor leaders was led by Clarence Darrow. The prosecution was headed up by William Borah, who later, of course, became a very prominent senator from Idaho. I think it's also worth pointing out, by the way, that the press covered it. The press came from everywhere. Came from London, came from New York, came from Chicago, came from Cleveland, came from all over to cover this, and they all knew. The jury consists of 12 Idaho farmers. It's hot in Boise in the summer. There's no air conditioning. They're sweating, they're spitting, they're whittling, and it was generally assumed that these 3 labor leaders it's over for them. They were acquitted. Mostly because Clarence Darrow, the hero of this moral tale, hid one of the prosecution's key witnesses. They couldn't find him, as we all know, living that close to Idaho. Idaho, it's impossible to get through Idaho now. It's even more difficult then. And so Darrow took one of the possible witnesses and hid him out somewhere up in the Coeur d'Alene region, and they never found him. But Lucas had, and I'll take him at his word, he had winnowed the field looking for a contest of classes that might reveal the soul of industrial America. He found Western stories. He selected one of the wildest of them, rendered it honestly and gracefully, and in the process shredded what was left of the Western master narrative. What would have happened to O'Donnell if somebody had given him $1,500 and he'd come out west? Would he have found an agricultural and rural paradise, or would he have found an urban and industrial world at least as harsh, at least as rigorous, at least as demanding as that of Fall River? I did ask Lucas what else was on his list, and though he didn't provide a list in any particular order, he was nice enough to tell me that Butte, 1912 to 1920, was in the running. I don't know how far it got, but obviously it made the first cut. But later, and I've had occasion to talk to a number of historians of American workers about this, we have asked a central question. Of all of the states of the American Union where social class tensions during the industrial stage were most strongly felt, what would be the top 5? Now, you can ask that question I've asked it of students too, and you always get the same kinds of answers. And they're perfectly appropriate answers. Well, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New Jersey, New York. This is my list. The states of the American Union where social class tensions, which weren't supposed to be a part of the Western experience at all, were most strongly felt. Colorado would top my list, my native state. I would put Montana second, California third, Arizona fourth, Washington 6th, because it's pretty hard to ignore the strike in Flint in 1937. Where is Paul at? That one has got to be in there somewhere. The industrial states certainly revealed social class tensions, but I think that if you really want to find them, and Tony clearly did, I would go to Colorado. I have more, but we have reached the end of my allotted time. And so I am, with that, going to conclude. But we are happy, and there may be some questions. I hope so. And I certainly would be happy to entertain them. So I think I'll skip myths about Montana, unless somebody asked me specifically what I was going to talk about had I had time. Thank you.
David will take questions, and I will be roaming with a microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will come to you. Okay?
Or you can stand up and yell, and I can hear.
Let's hear some myths about Montana.
Well, I was going to do two things. Number one, I was going to try to explain where the myths came from, and without naming names. I don't think Montanans have done a very good job of adjusting to the reality. The reality of Montana is it is urban and industrial. We were, and also very Catholic. We were second. Montana was second to New Mexico in percentage of Catholics. It was second to North Dakota in percentage of immigrants. Catholics in 1926, immigrants in 1920. As late as 1971, of Montana's 56 counties, 30 were predominantly Catholic, 18 were mixed Protestant, 8 were Lutheran. That's, it's an immigrant, industrial, urban, and let's say non-Protestant dominated state, and none of that was supposed to be there. That would be the first one. And I think that our inability to come fully to grips with that, to meet that reality. I mean, ExxonMobil right now controls, it's the biggest oil company in the world, I think, and they control about 3% of the refining capacity of the world in oil. The Anaconda Company once controlled 25 to 40% of the manufacture of copper in the world. The incongruity of Montana with the Anaconda smelter and the Butte mines. The Butte mines, the drifts and the stopes run for 10,000 miles under Butte. 22 billion pounds of copper ore has come out of the Butte Hill. Montana was an industrial monolith. We were an industrial colossus. Montana's income and wages were first in the nation coming from industrial sources. Not from agriculture, not from transportation, not from light manufacture, but from heavy industrial manufacture. I wish that Charlie Russell had decided one day to take his easel and move it up to Big Butte and paint Montana true. Now, I know why he didn't, but I still wish he had. And I wish we would do a little bit better job of coming to a frank acknowledgement of the reality of Montana history. But the Anaconda Company is a troublesome presence, and a number of myths. And I think, the unforgivable sin of the Anaconda Company was that it blew up the myth. And I think that's very, very much a part of the reason that it has been so vilified. Now, I should add as a disclaimer here that I don't find the Anaconda Company a warm and fuzzy industrial corporation either, although I am more willing to defend it than most. But it paid all of the state's bills. And the myths that have been told about it, 1/3 of Montana's population lived in Anaconda Company towns. 1/2 of Montana's wage earners took home checks drawn on Anaconda Company accounts. This is as late as 1950. And speaking of which, as late as 1950, Montanans were first in the nation in per capita income, first in the nation in per capita wealth. In 1960, we were in the top 5. In 1970, we were still in the top 10. We're now something like 48th. So, freedom from the thraldom of the Anaconda Company on occasion begins to look like economic freefall. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. Speaking of acknowledgments, the German governments, after both World Wars I and II, said openly, they didn't mention Anaconda by name, that the thing that stunned them was America's ability to mobilize its industrial base. They knew that we would fight. What they didn't believe was that our industrial captains would respond with anything like the enthusiasm. Anaconda was marginally enthusiastic, but that they would ever respond as they did. That's what defeated. I mean, we won 2 world wars, not because of the Anaconda Company. I would certainly hate for that to leave this room as the object lesson of the evening. But it would be rather difficult to imagine winning it without it. I mean, 75% of the brass available to the Allied armies in the First World War came from Anaconda's smelter. Now, brass being, of course, copper and zinc, and useful in war, I'm told. So, but the stories told about the Anaconda Company, many of them are simply false. For example, the Standard Oil Company never had anything to do with the running of the Anaconda Company. It had no ownership stake in the Anaconda Company or in Amalgamated, which was the holding company of Anaconda. Standard Oil was not involved. Standard Oil executives were involved, but Standard Oil as a corporate entity was not. The Anaconda, the newspaper story, they owned all the newspapers. True, they did. What's usually ignored in all of that was they were the best newspapers Montana has ever had. Certainly the Anaconda Standard was, at least until the 1920s, when it frankly went not just downhill, but almost journalistically out of sight. Environmental issues obviously are a key. It didn't build the Milltown Dam, its enemy did, William Andrews Clark. But the Anaconda Company was the first one to install catalytic converters. The first, 585-foot stacks, pretty big stack. It was the tallest smokestack in the whole world. Still may be. It was at one time the tallest freestanding masonry structure in the world. They were the first to put in settling ponds. They were the first to pay damages for harming, in this instance, federal property in the form of trees on Smelter Hill at Mount Hagen. So their record in labor relations, their record in political corruption, they lost more political fights than they won. And they lost all of the major political fights. They lost the Constitution in 1972. They lost the Capitol fight. They lost Senate battles. They lost the mayoral races in Butte and Anaconda. They lost on the net proceeds tax. They lost on the sales tax, which might be the most... The Anaconda Company always wanted Montana to have a sales tax. So Montanans were always able to deal with the Anaconda Company. The idea that they bullied us and shoved us into a corner and picked our pockets is, it's a little too self-pitying, and I think that, but I think it arises from the fact that we're still a little bit uncomfortable with the reality of our past, which is, again, I repeat, industrial and urban. We're not a rural state. You read that all the time. We've got little islands, urban islands. I'm not denying that there are farmers and ranchers in Montana, but we have urban islands with nothing in between. We are, as has been said, and I love the phrase, a medium-sized city with very long streets. So that's where I would have gone. But it was hard, I think, to deal with, you have books about Montana, an uncommon land, Montana, high, wide, and handsome, big sky country, last best place. I think it's all of those things. I would rather be here than anywhere I've ever been. So this is no assault on Montana. It is, however, I hope, a gentle rebuke of those who have not quite faced up to the full mythical aspect of Montana's history and of the striking contrast between the myth and the reality of Montana's past. But that's true throughout the West. That's why I gave you my list, starting with Colorado. Montana also had the highest percentage of its people members of unions. So you've got first in wages from industry, first in union membership, second in Catholics, second in immigrants, and I don't know, there are others. I can't remember my own list now. Others. No, I can hear. That's fine.
America's famous author John Cheever, great novelist and short story writer, recently died. In an interview on NPR one time, said that it is fiction that teaches the truth about history. And I'm just wondering if you would recommend a book that would teach us a little bit more about that truth you're talking about.
Well, there are 3 books. I almost brought them in because except you'd need a wheelbarrow. They're that big. Richard Slotkin is the name that has come up. And Slotkin's 3 books. The first one was called Regeneration Through Violence. The subtitle is The Mythology of the American Frontier, 1600 to 1860. The second volume is The Fatal Environment, but note the subtitles, The Myth of the Frontier in the Age of Industrialization. The third volume, Gunfighter Nation, The Myth of the Frontier in 20th Century America. Gunfighter Nation in particular, I think you'd find absolutely fascinating. because he deals with movies and he deals with Vietnam. In Vietnam, for example, when search and rescue missions were undertaken, the American soldiers would often invite journalists to accompany them and say, we're going to go play cowboys and Indians. Marlboro country came up again and again when they would move into areas. I think, when a president of the United States strides across an aircraft carrier with a great big mission accomplished sign on it, walking like a gunslinger in a bad Western movie, I think that what we have here is striking evidence that the myth survives. That too much time, that's why I said that this myth has had some very mischievous consequences. I was asked by the sponsor of this series if I wanted any audio or visual, and I'm not as alert to all of the technological possibilities as I should be, so I didn't even think of this. But the only one I wanted, I figured I couldn't have. But I think a lot of you will recall this scene from Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Bomb. And it's the scene where the character played by Slim Pickens mounts the atomic bomb as it is about to be released from the bomb hold with his 10-gallon hat, takes it off, whooping and hollering, and what you have essentially is the cowboy myth meets the nuclear winter. But if I could have shown that, I could have gone and joined you all, and we could have sat back and stared at it, because the myth has had a very, very firm hold on our consciousness and on our politics. And it hasn't always worked out as well as we might like. I think the assumption that the Iraqis would greet us as liberators is a very Western kind of phenomenon. That's what the cavalry did. They came riding in and they saved us. But the notion that all peoples in the world want the same freedom that we want and define it in the same way we do seems also to me a very American notion that has, it's regeneration through violence, as Slotkin would put it. A lot of people can want to be free to choose to be unfree, if that makes any sense. There was a guy named Charles Loring Brace, and he had an outfit called the Children's Something or Other Society. This is in the 1860s in New York. And Charles Loring Brace believed that Catholicism enslaved Catholics. That, as a matter of fact, he came to believe that in the inferiority of Catholic peoples because they didn't seem to want to be free. At least slaves in the American South wanted to be free, but American Catholics didn't even have a sense to know that they weren't. And so he literally took the children, all overwhelmingly Irish. He first sent his representatives into the Five Points district of New York, into the Irish parts of New York, where some of them even survived, barely. This was dangerous duty, and they went in to convert them. It did not work, but it was the same approach that they took in the effort to proselytize and bring the faith to American Indians. When this didn't work, Charles Loring Brace and his group literally took Irish kids off the streets of New York. Not all of them were orphans. Took them away from families and sold them and loaded them up into they were called the orphan trains, and shipped them out west. I mean, some of them were 8, 9 years old. The best estimate is upwards to 50 or 60,000 kids went out. He was freeing them, though. In his own mind, this was an act of liberation. It arises, I don't know, the other thing that I have no answer to, and when I was in graduate school, we were always asking one another this question, but nobody's ever provided an answer. It's been a long time since I was in graduate school. But why did the Canadians, they had a frontier. Australians had a frontier. Brazilians had a frontier. South Africans had a frontier. But let's take Canada or closer. Why are our stories so much different from theirs? And the effect of all of it, I'm not taking sides on any of these issues, don't misunderstand, but let's take gun laws or death penalty or foreign policy. Why do the Canadians, why is the Canadian West, they have rodeos, they have pickup trucks, their Indian policy, their approach to their native peoples, strikingly different from our own. But the myth world in Western Canada is very different from the myth world here. And I have absolutely no idea why. I have some thoughts. They didn't have a California. I think the California gold rush threw the entire Western movement off course. I mean, that was just a mad dash, and there was nothing like that in Canada. And not only that, the British government policed Canada in a way that the American government never policed the Western United States. But it still doesn't quite satisfy me. So and Slotkin asked that same question. But if I were to recommend anybody, it would be Slotkin, particularly the third volume, Gunfighter Nation. Well, I think it's an appropriate time to celebrate St. Patrick's Day in the conventional way. So thank you again for your attention.